Hey there. Ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling something pretty fascinating. It's Allan Kardec's The Genesis, specifically Chapter 8.
Oh, a classic.
Yeah, and in it, Kardec lays out this whole concept of a coming, what he calls a regeneration of humankind.
Mm.
So kind of a big deal. And
Regeneration. What a word.
right, and get this, he wasn't talking about some far-off future. Kardec was writing this back in 1868. He actually believed this transformation.
This regeneration.
Yeah, this regeneration was already starting to happen.
Wow. So right then and there, he's seeing the seeds of change, huh?
That's what he says. So it's the 1860s, and Kardec's looking around, and he's noticing all these shifts, not just in society, but also, and this is where it gets really interesting, in the spirit world, too.
Okay, now we're talking. This is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah, and he links it all back to some kind of massive cosmic shift that's going on.
I mean, it's Kardec. Big ideas are kind of his thing.
Right. So our deep dive today, well, it's all about trying to make sense of some pretty big questions.
Okay.
Like, what exactly did Kardec envision for this new era, this regenerated humanity? How did he think it would actually all go down?
Right.
And maybe the biggest question of all, is any of this relevant to us, over 150 years later?
Still grappling with those big questions, eh?
Always. So let's start by unpacking one of Kardec's core ideas. It's this concept of progress.
Okay.
He believed that there's this constant natural movement toward improvement, both physically and morally.
And this isn't some random chaotic process, right? He saw it as very ordered, very intentional.
Right. So how did he explain that?
He had this great analogy. He compared it to like a plant growing. It has its seasons, its times of really rapid growth, and there's just some stages that you can't skip. It has to unfold in a certain way.
So is he saying, like, humanity is going through this big growth spurt and it's got to shed some of its old beliefs to make room for new ones?
You got it.
Yeah.
That's exactly what he's saying. And here's another layer, because this is Kardec we're talking about.
Right.
He even believed that God, actively participates in this whole progress thing, working through spirits, natural laws. He even brought in the influence of, get this, celestial bodies.
Wait, hold on. Celestial bodies? Is he talking about astrology here?
Not astrology in, the modern sense. It was more about this broader cosmic influence. For example, he brings up this case of a meteor shower
Oh, okay.
that happened right before a devastating epidemic on Maurice Island.
Whoa. Is he saying that meteor shower was like a sign? Like a warning from the cosmos?
He definitely seems to suggest some kind of connection between those events, earthly and celestial.
Interesting.
But let's step back from the cosmic stuff for a second.
Okay.
Because beyond all that, Kardec really felt that humanity was at this crucial turning point. Like we'd simply outgrown our old beliefs and institutions. He even uses the word adulthood to describe it. Like humanity's reached adulthood, but we're still clinging to these childish things. Kind of like when you hit 30 and realize you still haven't quite figured out how to do your taxes.
Yeah, I feel that.
Right. But what's interesting is how Kardec contrasted this with the big philosophical trend of his time, materialism. He saw materialism as this really limiting force, pushing back against humanity's natural desire for something greater, something infinite.
So where does spiritism fit into all this? Was that Kardec's answer to this materialist dead end?
You could definitely see it that way. I mean, Kardec believed that Spiritism provided the necessary framework, to really understand the spirit world, reincarnation, even our true purpose
Okay.
as spiritual beings, right? He thought this kind of understanding gave people hope and helped them overcome that deep fear of death that he thought was holding them back.
So spiritism is revealing a whole new dimension to life. It's kind of blowing things wide open.
Absolutely. And Kardec didn't stop there. He was adamant that true progress, to reach true happiness, it wasn't enough to just be smart, to just have intellectual advancement. He emphasized moral growth as the real key.
So we can't just be smart, we got to be good too.
That's it in a nutshell. He championed charity, fraternity, even unity of belief, but a belief grounded in something higher,
Okay, but this all sounds pretty abstract. I mean, what specific things was Kardec actually seeing back in 1868 that made him think this shift was already underway?
Well, he pointed to some pretty concrete things. The rise of humanitarian organizations, for one. He also saw a trend toward more humane laws, less prejudice between nations. He even pointed to a kind of reaction against materialism itself as a sign of the times.
Wow. So he's really tying these very real social changes to this larger spiritual framework he's laying out.
Absolutely. And this is where his idea of a new generation comes in. And he wasn't just talking about like physical births. He envisioned a new generation of spirits entering the world, and these spirits were coming in with this like inclination towards goodness.
Okay, hold on. Now things are getting really interesting. New generation of spirits, huh? What did he mean by that?
Well, according to Kardec, this new generation, they would have this innate goodness. They would be naturally drawn to reason, and they would have a much deeper connection to their spiritual nature.
Wow, okay.
And get this, he even quotes Jesus in the Bible, that line about this generation will not pass away until all these things have been fulfilled, emphasizing that it's a gradual process.
Gotcha. So it's not like some overnight revolution. It's more of a slow and steady shift over time.
Precisely.
But what about the people who, didn't get the memo? The ones stuck in the old ways? Didn't Kardec call them stragglers?
He did. And he drew a pretty stark contrast between them and this new generation. So, the new generation is all about innate goodness, reason, spirituality. The stragglers are clinging to selfishness, materialism, rejecting any idea of a higher power. Yeah, quite a difference.
Okay. So how did Kardec think this whole generational shift would play out in society? Were the good guys going to win in the end?
Well, to explain that, he used this really powerful analogy. He compared it to a military regiment.
Okay.
Imagine a regiment full of these undisciplined, chaotic soldiers. And then you have these few good soldiers mixed in, but they're just outnumbered. They can't change the whole dynamic.
Yikes. Sounds like a nightmare for any commander.
Right. So now imagine those troublesome soldiers are gradually replaced, one by one, with well-behaved, disciplined recruits. Over time, the entire regiment changes. Not through some big dramatic revolt, but through this slow, steady influx of new energy.
Okay, I'm seeing the picture. So it's like this influx of good spirits is slowly shifting the balance of power in society.
Exactly. And there's more. Kardec actually believed that even calamities, things like epidemics, wars, could accelerate this whole transition. He thought they forced humanity to confront its flaws and ultimately lead to moral improvement in the long run.
Wow, so even the bad stuff is part of this bigger plan for progress. That's a pretty intense way to look at things.
It is, and it even hints at a call to action. It's like he's suggesting that those who understand these principles, they have a responsibility to contribute to this progress through their own actions.
A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've got cosmic influences, a new generation of spirits, even global calamities, and they're all playing a part in this, grand scheme of moral evolution, according to Kardec.
Wow. Before we go too far down this rabbit hole, maybe it's a good time to pause and consider what all this means for us today.
A good point. I mean, this is a lot to digest, even for the most dedicated deep divers. Right. So, listener, while we take a quick break, think about this. What resonates with you in Kardec's vision? Do any of his observations about the signs of the times feel relevant in our world today?
Big questions to ponder as we delve even deeper into Kardec's fascinating and maybe even prophetic Chapter 8 when we come back.
All right. Welcome back to our deep dive into Allan Kardec's vision of human regeneration. Before the break, we asked you to consider if any of Kardec's, observations from 1868, if any of that resonated with our world today.
A pretty big question, right? I mean, so much has changed since then. It's almost hard to wrap your head around.
I know. It's a whole different world. We've got climate change, political polarization. Now there's AI, artificial intelligence. It's like a whole different ball game.
Right. So it really makes you wonder, can a framework from the 1800s, can it really help us understand, all the stuff we're dealing with in the 21st century?
That's the million-dollar question. So let's try this. Let's imagine, just for a minute, that Kardec is here with us, right here in the studio.
Okay. I like it.
He's looking around at our world. Where would he see progress? What would he be thinking?
Well, if you remember, one of the key things that Kardec pointed to as a sign of progress was the development of humanitarian institutions and just more humane law, more humane social structures in general.
He saw that happening back in his time.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think it's fair to say that at least on a global scale, we've seen a huge expansion of humanitarian efforts since then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Think about all the organizations dedicated to alleviating poverty, fighting diseases, promoting education. I mean, there's a lot of good work being done.
There is. And we've seen some pretty big shifts in legal systems and social norms too towards, greater inclusivity, recognizing human rights.
Exactly.
Things like advancements in civil rights, LGBTQ plus rights, disability rights.
So much has changed.
Yeah, these are all pointing towards a more humane and just society, which is exactly what Kardec was talking about.
Okay. So on that front, it seems like we might actually be moving in the direction he envisioned.
It seems that way, yeah.
But what about the spiritual side of things? Because he was really big on moral progress, overcoming selfishness, embracing higher principles like charity and fraternity. Do you think he'd see that happening today?
That's a tough one, isn't it? Because on one hand, you see incredible acts of compassion and altruism all the time.
Yeah.
People coming together to help each other out, these movements for social justice, even just a growing global awareness of how interconnected we all are. And those are all positive signs.
But then you turn on the news and it's all conflict and division. Sometimes it feels like we're going backward, like there's just no empathy out there.
It's definitely a paradox, but I think Kardec would recognize this tension. Remember, he didn't believe progress was this straight line,
Right.
He used that plant analogy to show that growth happens in these cycles, periods of rapid development, followed by periods of, maybe things seem to stall or even go backward a little.
So like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but the overall trend is still positive.
Yeah, something like that. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about our own progress, both individually and as a society.
Yeah.
There are always going to be setbacks
Right.
and people who resist change.
Those stragglers, as Kardec called them.
Exactly. But if we zoom out a little, if we look at the big picture of history, I think there's evidence there for moral evolution, even if it's, not always a smooth ride.
Okay, that makes me feel a little bit better. But Kardec also talked about this new generation of spirits being born, and they're coming into the world with this natural inclination towards good. You think that's still happening?
That's a really interesting question.
But
it's hard to say for sure, right? We can't exactly measure spiritual evolution.
yeah, there's no spiritual measuring stick.
Right.
Right.
But I do think if you look at younger generations today, there does seem to be this heightened awareness of social justice, a deeper concern for the environment, a more, fluid and inclusive way of looking at things like identity and relationships.
So they're less bound by the old rules and more open to exploring new ways of being.
That's one way to put it. But, it's not like every young person is this spiritually enlightened beacon of hope.
Uh-huh. Yeah, not every millennial is a yoga-loving vegan who spends their weekends volunteering.
Right. But it's about the overall trend. I think if Kardec were here today, he would see signs of this new generation emerging, even with all the chaos and uncertainty we're facing.
So even with all the challenges, even with the stragglers holding on to the old ways, you think he'd still be optimistic?
I do. Remember, he saw progress as a natural law, as God's will unfolding in the world. So yeah, even with all the ups and downs, I think he'd ultimately believe in humanity's inherent goodness and our ability to, keep evolving towards a more just and compassionate way of being.
It's a good message to hear, especially these days when it's so easy to get caught up in all the negative stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's an important one, too. Because if we lose faith in our capacity for progress, if we give in to that cynicism and despair, we become part of the problem.
We become the stragglers holding everyone back.
Exactly. So it's up to all of us, no matter how old we are or where we come from, to embrace that spirit of progress and contribute to, that positive evolution of humanity.
So we're all part of this regeneration, even if we don't always realize it?
Precisely. Every act of kindness, every time we try to understand each other better, every step we take towards those higher principles of charity and fraternity, it all contributes to creating that brighter future that Kardec envisioned.
It's kind of empowering, isn't it? We actually have a role to play in this whole cosmic drama.
Absolutely. It's a powerful thought to carry with us as we navigate all the complexities of the world we live in.
Okay. We've talked about the positive signs, the areas where Kardec might see progress happening today. But let's flip the script for a second. Where do you think he'd see us falling short? Where are we still straggling behind?
Ooh, that's a good question. And it might take us into some, uncomfortable territory, but it's important to explore those shadows, too, if we really want to get a full picture of what Kardec was talking about.
You're right. We can't just focus on the feel-good stuff. Let's get real. Where would he see us messing up?
Well, remember how critical he was of materialism?
Yeah.
How he saw it as this force working against progress? I think he'd have a lot to say about, our modern obsession with consumerism, with just acquiring more and more stuff, at the expense of spiritual growth and real human connection.
Yeah, it's like we're drowning in stuff, but starved for meaning.
Exactly. And social media with all its comparisons and, everyone trying to present these perfect lives, I don't think that would sit too well with him either.
Yeah, no kidding.
I think he'd see social media as this like double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can connect people across the globe, foster empathy. But on the other hand, it can also really amplify our egotistical tendencies.
Yeah.
It leads to all that comparing and envy and just this sense of separation.
Okay, so not a huge fan of social media then. What about our relationship with the planet? Because Kardec was really big on humans being stewards of the earth, responsible for taking care of it. How do you think he'd view the whole environmental crisis we're in right now?
I think he'd be deeply concerned. I mean,
Yeah.
really concerned.
Yeah.
He believed in the interconnectedness of all things, the balance between the physical and spiritual realms.
Right.
And I think he would see, our exploitation of natural resources, the way we're contributing to climate change, as a really serious moral failing.
So we're failing the care for the planet test big time. What about things like, political polarization, all the social unrest, the rise of extremism? How do those things fit into Kardec's vision?
I think he'd see those as expressions of that, like selfishness and disunity he was always warning about. Remember, he believed that true progress requires a shift towards fraternity, towards understanding that we're all part of one human family, united by this shared spiritual essence.
Which is definitely not the message you get from a lot of political discourse these days.
Not at all.
It's all us versus them, dividing people into these little boxes based on their ideology or identity.
Exactly. And I think Kardec would see that as this huge obstacle to progress. He really believed that this shared understanding of our spiritual nature, our purpose, what he called unity of belief, was absolutely crucial for creating a more just and harmonious world.
So maybe instead of focusing on what divides us, we should be trying to find that common ground, that shared humanity that goes beyond our differences.
Precisely. I think that's one of the most powerful messages we can take away from Kardec's work.
Yeah.
It's this reminder that we're all in this together, all part of this grand evolutionary journey, and that, ultimately our destinies are intertwined.
Okay, I'm feeling a bit more hopeful again. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have one more question for you. Kardec talked about how these big calamities could actually accelerate progress, right? They force humanity to confront its flaws and then evolve.
Right.
Do you think there are any calamities happening today that might be, serving that purpose?
Ooh, that's a really provocative question. And it's one that we need to be careful with, right? We don't want to fall into that trap of like romanticizing suffering or seeing tragedy as some kind of, divine punishment.
Right. No, we're definitely not about that.
Yeah. But if we step back and look at things from a broader perspective, I think there are certain events happening that are, shaking us up a bit, forcing us to reevaluate what's really important.
Can you give me an example? What kind of events are you thinking about?
Well, I mean, the pandemic, the global pandemic we all went through, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah.
It was this collective trauma, this shared experience of loss and uncertainty that really exposed how fragile our systems are and how interconnected we all are.
Yeah, it definitely brought out both the best and worst in people.
Absolutely. There were these incredible acts of selflessness and compassion, but also, fear and division and that whole us versus them thing again.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the point, right?
Yeah.
These calamities don't automatically make us better. They just present us with an opportunity to evolve, to confront our shadows, and make a conscious decision to choose a different path.
Like a cosmic wake-up call, a chance to hit the reset button and really think about what matters.
Exactly. And I think that's a really valuable perspective to have as we navigate, all the challenges that we're going to face in the future.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this second part of our deep dive into Kardec's The Genesis. We've talked about areas where he might see progress happening, areas where we're still lagging behind, and how even these calamities can act as like catalysts for growth.
A lot of complex ideas for sure.
It's a lot to think about. So listener, before we head into the final part of our exploration, we want to leave you with this question. If Kardec were here with us today, what specific developments, what trends would he point to as evidence of progress or, regression? What would stand out to him as like the biggest challenges, the biggest opportunities facing humanity in the 21st century?
Yeah, really think about that for a moment.
We'll delve deeper into these questions when we come back. All right, welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into Allan Kardec's The Genesis, specifically Chapter 8, where he's talking about this whole idea of, a coming regeneration of humankind. We've been looking at how he saw it playing out back in his time and, trying to imagine what he'd make of our world today.
And right before the break, we asked you to really put yourselves in Kardec's shoes. Like, imagine he's here with us looking at all the stuff that's happening in the 21st century. What would he see as signs of progress? What would make him think, whoa, humanity's really backsliding here? What would be like the biggest issues on his radar?
It's a pretty wild thought experiment, right? I mean, the world has changed so much since 1868. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kardec wouldn't even recognize half the stuff we take for granted.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, the internet. It's a whole other level of complexity. Trying to apply like a 19th century framework to 21st century problems, it's a real challenge.
It is. So let's say Kardec walks into the studio right now. First thing he sees is all our fancy recording equipment, our computers. What do you think he'd make of all this technological advancement, progress, or just a distraction from, our spiritual purpose?
I think on one level, he'd be pretty amazed by all the progress we've made in science and technology. I mean, remember, Kardec was all about intellectual progress, about using reason and scientific inquiry to better humanity.
So he'd be cool with all the gadgets and gizmos as long as we were using them for good. Not just to, make ourselves more comfortable or create more division between people.
Exactly. It always comes back to that moral element for Kardec. True progress wasn't about material gain or even intellectual advancement. It was about becoming more compassionate, more just, more in tune with, our spiritual core.
Right. So technology, it's a mixed bag. What about some of the other big challenges we're facing today, like climate change? I feel like that would be a major concern for him, given how much he emphasized our role as stewards of the earth.
Oh, without a doubt. I think he would be really saddened by the state of our environment, by how recklessly we've exploited natural resources and messed with that delicate balance of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
He saw the physical and spiritual realms as deeply interconnected. So any harm we inflict on the planet, it's going to have ripple effects on our souls too.
Like we're not just polluting the planet, we're polluting ourselves in the process.
Exactly. And I think he'd be especially worried about how climate change is going to impact future generations. Those new spirits he believed were coming to Earth with that natural inclination towards good.
Yeah, we're kind of leaving them a mess to clean up.
It's a tough inheritance for sure, but I also believe that Kardec would see this crisis as like a major wake-up call, a chance for humanity to come together and, make a conscious choice to change course.
So there's still hope. We haven't totally screwed things up.
I don't think so. Kardec really believed in the power of human will, in our ability to choose a different path. He'd see the growing awareness of climate change, all the activism, the people demanding change, as signs that something is shifting.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Mm.
But what about all the other craziness going on in the world? I mean, the political polarization, the social unrest, the rise of extremism. How would he fit all that into his whole vision of progress?
Mm. I think he would see those things as like symptoms of that moral stagnation he was always warning about. He saw selfishness, pride, a lack of unity. Those were the biggest roadblocks to progress.
Yeah.
And all the stuff you just mentioned, it just feeds into that negativity, that sense of separation and division.
Right. Instead of focusing on what unites us, we get obsessed with our differences.
Exactly. We cling to our tribes, our ideologies, our echo chambers.
Hmm.
And anyone who thinks differently becomes the enemy. Like we've completely forgotten about our shared humanity.
Yeah, that whole unity of belief thing that Kardec was talking about, it seems pretty far off these days.
It does, doesn't it? And he would see that as a huge problem. Because without that shared understanding of our spiritual nature, our purpose, it becomes so much harder to create a just and harmonious world.
Oh, okay. So we've talked about the technology, the climate crisis, all this social and political turmoil. It's a lot, and it's pretty heavy stuff. But amid all this chaos, where would Kardec find those glimmers of hope? Where would he see evidence that this regeneration he was talking about, that it's still happening?
That's a good question. I think he'd see hope in the movements for social justice that are gaining momentum all over the world. The increasing awareness of systemic inequalities and, the genuine efforts being made to create a more inclusive and equitable society.
So things like the advancements in civil rights, LGBTQ plus rights, disability rights, those would all be positive signs to him.
Definitely. He saw fraternity, that deep recognition of our shared humanity, regardless of, race, religion, or social status, as a fundamental part of a truly evolved society.
And what about the spiritual side of things? Would he see any evidence of that new generation of souls coming in with that innate goodness?
I think so. I think he'd see it in the passion so many young people have for social justice, their deep concern for the environment, their willingness to, challenge the status quo and fight for a better world.
They really seem to embody that spirit of progress, that yearning for something better, something more just and compassionate.
They do, and while it's easy to, romanticize youth and attribute all positive change to them, it's more complicated than that, right? There will always be those who resist progress,
Yeah.
who cling to the old ways. But what's crucial is the overall trend, the direction we're moving in as a collective.
So, big question. Do you think Kardec would be optimistic about the future? With all the challenges we're facing, do you think he'd see us heading in the right direction?
I do. I really do. Remember, he saw progress as this kind of natural law, as God's will unfolding in the world. And yeah, there are going to be setbacks, periods of regression, times when it feels like we're just stuck. But ultimately, I think he had faith in humanity's inherent goodness, in our ability to keep moving, keep evolving towards a brighter future.
It's a powerful message and one that we need to hear right now. Because it's easy to lose hope, to get overwhelmed by all the negativity. But if we give up, if we let cynicism win, then we become part of the problem.
That's it. We become the stragglers.
Right. So, listener, as we wrap up our deep dive into Allan Kardec's vision of human regeneration, we want to leave you with this. What role are you going to play in this whole unfolding story? Will you be a force for progress, helping to build a world where peace, justice, and understanding prevail? Or will you cling to the old ways, to fear and division, to the illusion that we're all separate? The choice is yours, and truly, the future of humanity hangs in the balance. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make a difference.
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep those deep dives going.